My name is Scott Andrew Bartley. My friends call me Drew, and I'm the author of a upcoming article called The Tilden Family of Lebanon, New Hampshire, which will be appearing in the New Hampshire Genealogical Record in volume 33, number 2. I first got started in genealogy in 1971 when I was in grade school. We were assigned a research project and we had one of three topics to choose from. One was to research your family back to your great great grandparents if you could. Being a typical kid, I thought this would be the easy way out because I had several great grandparents living at the time. So I chose the genealogy project, and it has been my major hobby ever since. I joined the New England Historic Genealogical Society in 1978 during my first year of college. After college, I went to work and then returned to Vermont and eventually was laid off in 1984. And when I was looking for a new job, I had time to do more research. And this was the first time I'd really conducted major research since I had started in the 70s. I would go down to the New England Historic Genealogical Society, where I got to know the librarians there, George Sanborn, David Dearborn, Gary Boyd Roberts. These are names that you might recognize. And these were people that became my friends and my mentors. They recognized my aptitude towards researching in this, and they asked me to submit a client report. Since I wasn't taking clients at the time, I just used work that I was doing for a friend while I was down in the library. Once they reviewed what I had written up, I was offered a job for the research service and then became a genealogical journeyman there. It was from them that I learned all the tricks of the trade and learned a few of my own on the way. The same year, I was asked to join an informal group known as the Boston Genealogical Group. This was a professional group of genealogists in the Boston area that would meet once a month, and we would talk about all kinds of projects we were working on. Some were genealogical editors, some worked in the library where I did, and others just did client work like I did when I first started out. I worked at NEHGS for 13 years in many departments, but I was always a reference librarian, and ultimately I became their manuscripts curator. I had gone back to school during this time for my master's degree in library science, which was a place that I had found a home early in grade school as well. I had been working in libraries since I was in fifth grade. I then worked at the Massachusetts Society of Mayflower Descendants, and I worked there for 13 years as their librarian and a reviewer of lineages and became more adept at the resources for Mayflower lineages. I also, while I was there, became their editor for their scholarly journal, the Mayflower Descendant, and this overlapped with my working as the editor for Vermont Genealogy, a scholarly journal that I helped found with George Sanborn for the Vermont Genealogical Society. From there, I worked for the Family Search organization that we're all familiar with by creating content for their wiki. And the jewel of what I did was the work on the Boston, Massachusetts genealogy wiki for them. I did client work through the years, and then I was contracted again by NEHGS to be a genealogist for the early Vermont Settlers to 1784 study project, which I started in 2015 and where I am still today. When I was working on the sketch for Stephen Tilden, who was born in 1724 and died in 1813, he was of Hartford, Vermont, and I was trying to identify his lineage back to the immigrant. With this person, I was able to do it successfully, but it was not straightforward, nor was it found in print anywhere. I first sent my findings to Ruth Craig, the editor of the New Hampshire Genealogical Record. She convinced me that it would be more helpful to her readers if I could do the whole family that came to Lebanon, New Hampshire, and document that. My original submission was 4 pages long. Once I had completely revamped the article to her suggestion, it grew to 32 pages, and that's what's being published today. The hardest problem was identifying Stephen Ford Tilden's third wife, which I eventually identified as Judith Pierce, and what children belonged to her. It was not until I read through every document in Stephen's probate that I was able to find the one document linking everything together. This was a document that most would have dismissed as genealogically irrelevant. The last three children of Stephen have not been identified as to which mother they belong. The most interesting person was Stephen Ford Tilden. In his divorce proceeding, I found 24 depositions covering 78 images of documents that gave insight into his life and the life around him, and the not so pious nature of some of his activities with some of his neighbors. There were discussions on maidens coming in to do housework. Some of them were related, and other people that were describing events were related to him or his wife, who was the one who started the divorce case. But it gave an insight that you don't necessarily read in history books. So that was very interesting. And for anybody who wants to see a little more interesting side of colonial life, I urge them to read the article and see the sites, and then they can read all the depositions for themselves. The first is land records. It can be the key replacement source for anyone you're looking for who doesn't seem to have a probate. The second one is court records, which I just illuminated on. They are not easy to use, but for this family, they provided a view of this family that could be found nowhere else other than maybe somebody's personal private diary. Something I did not have time to dig into too deeply, but might be nice for another researcher to follow up on, is more details about each of the families mentioned in the depositions in the divorce. This article covers the essentials about each family group in the Tilden family and these related persons in the divorce cases, but you get a fuller picture of the community itself in Lebanon, Connecticut, where he was from, and of the people who moved up to Lebanon, New Hampshire. I did some research into who said what and how they were related, but a more intense study of all these parties involved would give a fuller picture and would be a benefit to everyone, historians and genealogists alike. I'm still working on the early Vermont settlers to 1784 today as my full-time employment. I should mention that the project was divided into two series. The first, for those who are arriving by 1771, will take the rest of my career to finish, and I do not intend to stop until I have finished it. The NEGR article on the Tilden family of Lebanon, New Hampshire came out of this work while I was working on the sketch for Stephen V. Tilden of Hartford. I try whenever possible to identify the ancestors of every sketch subject. Here, I had to research as much deeper than I would to prove the ancestry. The article was making sure that my research was fully utilized. It's the word that RCA, Bob Anderson has been getting me. It's a possoprotography study. Possoprotography. I have to look that up every time because I cannot say it. This is only the fourth scholarly project like that. And I mentioned this in some of my lectures. So the first one was the Palatine Migration by Hank Jones, where he did all those German settlers to 1710, 1711, just north of New York City. The second one is the Great Migration Project, which is still going on. The third one was Marcia Hoffman Rising, who did the Boot Heel of Missouri, and she did everybody. You know, she did them as a community, as a group. And she did it community by community until she got the whole boot. And that's why we're doing this geographically. You know, we started with my hometown, and I started with the next town, then the next town, I just went like that. Other projects I'm working on are the descendants of George Lamphere of Westerly, Rhode Island. I descend from him, but I actually don't know the exact lineage. I hope to publish a 5-generation genealogy on this family. I'm publishing an article in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, which is straightening out an issue that I found with 4 Daniel Lamphere men living in Westerly. It turned out to be only 3 men. In sorting them out, it became so detailed that it became an article instead of putting that in the genealogy, and I will eventually just reference that. I'm now faced with 4 Mary Lampheres, all first cousins in the 3rd generation, and I have all 4 of their marriages. I just don't know which Mary belongs, or I should say, which married Mary belongs to which family. I've been working on the descendants of Peter Bartley for 6 generations. This is my patrilineal ancestor. I've had a great time doing this, and I've also found many relatives that didn't live too far away from me that now I consider close friends. It's amazing how genealogy can bring you closer to people who you've never heard of before. I also have a great information about my ancestors, Abraham and Esther Young Oney, who lived in Smithfield, Rhode Island, moved up to Sackville, then Nova Scotia, now in New Brunswick, and ended up in my hometown of Springfield, Vermont. For this, I'm following all lines, not just the Oney surname. With my work on early Vermont settlers, there have been several spin-off things of note. I've identified a fire that happened in the State House in Boston, Massachusetts in December 1747. That fire resulted in some loss of records that doesn't seem to be widely known. I need to research that at some point, and I'll publish my findings to see what records were actually lost. I've learned more about the border issues with New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York while doing all this work, and I hope to have that in print at some point too. I am developing more and more resolute opinion on what I think happened with the border. Many of us may know that the king decided in 1764 that it was all belonging to New York, but I have been coming across small little records that keep telling me that the king had decided beforehand that this was all part of New Hampshire, and thus why we probably still call it the New Hampshire Grants. I have learned and continue to learn about sources and ideas for researching Vermont ancestors. For the earliest settlements, you really need to be aware of the border dispute and the time period in which you are researching, and that includes also where your ancestor lived. It will inform you as to the best places to look for information, which are generally will be in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, or Vermont. One key point to consider along the Connecticut River is that most towns were settled about at the same time on both sides of the river. Though one is in Vermont now and the other in New Hampshire, they often work together on many things. The first thing to consider is church records. I have found that these 2 towns generally start with one church between the 2 of them, and it is in no particular order which side of the river they'll be on. So if you're in New Hampshire and you're not finding any early church records, look at the town in Vermont across the river. And likewise, in Vermont, you'll need to do the same looking across at the New Hampshire town. While the Vermont Vital Record Card Index is easy to access and very handy for genealogists, it is wise to search for and cite the original town record instead if you have access to it. You can find more information in the original from the context and further research around the record itself. I have found a number of vital records in the town records that were not included, or maybe their cards are removed, from the statewide index. Realize that that statewide card index was made in 1919 to 1920 and was a public access index card file, so anyone could use it. And I'm sure there were lost or misplaced cards, which may have created some of these situations. Lastly, it is important to check newspapers for death records and some marriages. I've had several occasions where the only source for an event came from the newspaper. Do not rely solely on the search engine either. Dig deeper by reading the likely issues yourself. OCR, optical character recognition, is good for helping create an index, but it's not 100%. That's where the search engines go. Also, I have found missing issues in one database that are present in another. These are rare cases, but I have found that these issues are more than once, so you need to be aware of them.